But Colin had his series of encounters, I think, in search of a new kind of modernity, a reflexive modernity that could include the city and the historic city, which he recognized as being one of the great preoccupations of Italian modernism in the post-war years and even before. And then at the beginning, you see Colin is bouncing around. He starts off in Liverpool, he goes to the Warburg, he goes to Yale, he goes to Texas for 4 years, he comes back to Cornell for the first time, meets Alvin Boyarsky, goes to Cambridge, meets Peter Eisenman, comes back to Cornell for the long duration, already starts by 1970 going to the summer school of Alvin Boyarsky, and then shortly afterwards Alvin Boyarsky takes over the AA. He's also involved with the Institute, gets locked out of the Institute, and there's a whole history there. So there's this Rowe as a series of crises that has to be recovered from. The constant rebuilding of the city, the constant rebuilding of his reality, and his theory as he evolves through time within this larger arc of the reflexive modernity.
Today, by showing our work and proposing a simple urban model based on Colin Rowe's ideas, I want to enlist his help toward establishing a model of urban form that we can use to help make cities again, so that there's an ordered idea that we can all share. The fact that urban design is not much realized in the real world today, either in existing or new cities, does not mean there is no knowledge of how to achieve it. Why is it not done? We can still make dense urban fabrics to slide under these lonely towers if we tried. Colin's brilliance here was to deploy this notion of an interdependency of elements to describe city form. Derived from painting and perceptual psychology, Colin's figure ground, one of the first things he did in the studio, is after all the study of spatial fields and their components. The duality of a figure ground field is conceptually necessary for contextualism, for phenomenal transparency, and for collage too.
Ma ancora di più penso alla cultura disciplinare del mio paese, a mio parere pericolosamente incline al dirigismo del migliore dei mondi possibili, all'utopia assoluta. Oggi è la città implosiva, domani chissà, all'imposizione di ricette ideologiche e conformiste, in cui ti viene sempre più difficile sostenere la tesi dell'inclusione rispetto a quelle dell'imposizione totalizzante del modello unico. Grazie.
Microurbanism of Rome. Although never specifically referring to the microurbanism of Rome, Colin's approach to this in-between relationship between architecture and urban form was fundamental to his teaching urban design during my time as a student in his studio around 1970. His basic premise, as I understand it, follows. Although the methodology I'm using owes a great deal to Colin's colleagues, my teachers, Bernard Hoseley, who was also teaching at Cornell at the time I was a student, and he was my teacher for one term, as well as Klaus Herdig, who I knew more as a colleague at Columbia. In Rome, both city and building are interdependent to such an extent that considering one without the other leaves one with an incomplete understanding of either.
My reaction to the notion of history and the city and the apparent conflict with how to be innovative and new when one is living in a context that is so old and apparently untouchable. I think we would argue as urban designers that the city, no matter how old, is a present reality for those people who occupy it, and it is a process of continuing and not a process of breaking and rebelling in those terms. And I think the teaching of Colin made us all very much aware of that.
Colin, always the alchemist at heart, conjures the Rome, the lost and unknown city, a Rome that could have been but never was, a Rome history that might have been but never was. It's certainly true that our history, more specifically Colin's history, was an alibi for topological and contextual concern, which positioned us for design in both the spirit of Noli's aesthetic and in terms of Colin's interest in figure to ground. But these were the two-dimensional aspirations, and it strikes me that what has been overlooked is the true raison d'etre, the fictive history itself. Even though the exhibition posed itself as an argument about Rome, about Rome's urban tissue, and implied that something had been interrupted or lost since 1748, for Colin, the text was not so much about the design per se, but an excuse for him to indulge in his famous favorite game, and that is the what-ifs of history. Many of you know the game, and those that don't, listen carefully. It goes something like this. What if Queen Victoria were born Prince Victor, a male heir to the throne? What then? Or what if Napoleon had been born in Corsica 2 days earlier? That would mean he would have been born an Italian, not French. What then? What about Waterloo and all the rest?
If one interprets these ideal proposals as diagrams which are not intended to be built, but are rather to instruct, civilize, and edify the growth, change, and transformation processes of the city, then the effects of these proposals can be viewed as suggested by Mannheim and Colin Rowe in relation to the problems of the existing city. This is the area of Colin's thinking, what I think was in some way a kind of progressive side that resonated with me and can continue, I think, to instruct us about how to make cities, as I've tried to do with my constant work on Rome.
The fundamental conclusion, however, was that in order to truly proceed as urbanists, we need to realize this fundamental truth. We exist in time, which is inherently no better and no worse than other times, simply because we are part of that continuum. As designers, we have a fundamental responsibility to design for the here and the now with an obligation to respect the past and maintain hope for the future.
Last spring, I was teaching for the University of Notre Dame, and I was teaching the graduate studio devoted to urban design. Rodrigo Montenegro was one of 7 students in that studio. And I allowed myself to impose on them a fantasy which I've had for many years, which was to completely redo the entire Roma Inter Rota project.
First of all, this was a semester for us that was an introduction to urban design. So we were starting just to play around with these concepts and walking Rome, trying to figure out what the heck was going on, why this piazza was this shape, why Piazza Farnese is a little bit more regular than the piazza that's in front of the Pantheon. So using Noli as a teacher, I guess not much Noli, but the Rome that Noli documented as a teacher to guide us and know how we can recreate something like that, but also that would work in the 21st century. And we can.
The great lesson, I think, here, and a great technique had to do directly with that for the students. It was clearly an enormous advantage to be doing this here in Rome, which provides such an incredibly a set of resources to be able to do this kind of a project. I need to acknowledge that along the way, as with any studio, we had visiting critics.
One of the things we learned about Colin was an observation that Tom Schumacher made was Colin taught by the Socratic method in reverse, which is instead of the teacher asking a question, the student asked a question and got a weird answer and had to ask a lot more questions in order to learn anything. And this was really what he did. There's micro-architecture like furniture and silverware, and there's macro-architecture like London and Paris. Well, maybe more Paris than London. You know, an interesting observation, I may not have gotten this totally correct, but you know, I think what Colin was saying here is that there's lots of different scales of design, and they're all valid, but the designer needs to understand what scale you're operating at, and what are the techniques you use at that scale to intervene and to bring about design success. In a way, it's a framework for thinking about urban design, because it's really saying that, you know, the city has a Part T and has an urban design framework every bit as much as one can divine any kind of design synthesis out of a piece of furniture or silverware.
Perhaps the great love of Colin's life was the historic core of Rome with its picturesque, irregular plan. And he passed his knowledge and enthusiasm for the city to countless students and colleagues. So much did this permeate the generations, and even though it's frankly passé in most quarters today, one's knowledge of Roman nuance is still a litmus test for membership in the inner circle of conoscenti. One has to genuinely ask, however, if this is applicable to town planning today. Should it be? Has anyone in this room ever made a plan like this? Well, we know that one person has from yesterday. Or has anyone in history ever made a plan like this? Architects and town planners may add to the cumulative city, but they do not design it. The tradition of iconic detached buildings that began in the 18th century finally came to fruition in the early 20th century, and architecture became divorced from the city. Pick up any book about the history of modern architecture, and you will almost not find a single urban building, not one.
The teacher has to have a way to deal with the students. And when I was starting, I hadn't been a teacher for very long. So I asked when I could go to the student to talk to him or her. I would say, and I still do, what do you want to do? And silence like this, and say, well, it's easy. What do you want to do? And say, well, then you get started. Well, I thought about this. Yeah, that's good. And then I thought about that. He said, but it has something to it. And you get in a kind of a way of talking to the student that makes the student be really part of the deal.
It is a very amicable invitation, also a sudden provocation, coming from the distant places and distant times. It makes me rethink Colin Rowe as mental gestalt and mentor, Colin Rowe, the city and our contemporary urbanity, Colin Rowe, the artifacts and underlying concepts, Colin Rowe, the paradigm and fantasies of urban design. The Hedgehog and the Fox, it was mentioned earlier many times probably by Mike Dennis this morning, is an essay by Isaiah Berlin on Tolstoy's view of history. But Isaiah Berlin himself said of the essay, I never meant it very seriously. I meant it as a kind of enjoyable intellectual game, but it was taken seriously. Every classification throws light on something. In rereading this essay on Tolstoy's view of history, I ask myself, whether a similar essay on Colin Rowe's view of the city would exist. I do not know, but I owe him the knowledge about the fable. In addition, I owe him the feeling, the insight of Berlin with regard to Tolstoy may coincide with Colin's characteristic pattern of thinking and working. It comes from a deeply rooted ambiguity, the source of ironic creativity, artistic seduction, and urbanistic wisdom.